rehearsal of what is taken to be the trouble with educational research, trying to avoid the sort of characterization of the sort of dinosaur effect. You'll recall, some of you might recall in the late 90s, the sort of furore over a number of sort of reviews of educational research. There was a critique sponsored by Ofsted that James Keeling produced, quite a damning critique of educational research and its ineffectiveness. And then David Hargreaves weighed in with a lecture to the Teaching Standards Agency, in which he said, basically his point was that educational research, educational theory, had failed to effect any major system change. And he called on not so much teachers as researchers to make good that gap, that deficit. He called for educational research to serve a much more useful purpose to educators. And it's interesting that this discussion and the things that have come out of that were almost exactly paralleled by what was going on in the States. This wasn't just a little local thing in a country that no one apparently listens to anymore. This was being paralleled in other major jurisdictions, and the same sorts of arguments were being made out, with much the same effect. Now, Hargreaves' main 2 points were, I think, that there was a lack of cumulative research in education. In other words, there was a lack of stuff that was building on earlier stuff. There was lack of the ability to replicate results. And fundamentally, there was a lack of any development of a coherent theory as a result of it. It's also, he argued, a lot of education research, and a very large proportion of education research simply wasn't really so practical research. Just to unpack those two very briefly, I think this idea that, in a sense, we lack an educational paradigm, we lack a set of principles that most of us can subscribe to, and from which we take our practice, is a major concern. Hargreaves said that teachers can be very effective in their work while remaining in total ignorance of the theory and knowledge provided by the foundational disciplines. And it is true that there is this huge disconnect still between educational theory and teaching and learning practice. And just two sets of examples, really. One is that it's, you could list, I just put two that are currently of major concern, I guess, to my job. And I work as Director of Innovation and Learning with a group of 26 schools in Girls' Day School Trust. Two of the things that strikes me are happening very, very rapidly. One of them, one-to-one devices, usually iPads, but one-to-one devices in the classroom strikes me as the major, I mean, we've been promised for decades that ICT in education is on the precipice of something. Probably a huge cliff. But we're on the edge of something. I think it's going to, one-to-one, actually devices in pupils' hands is going to be the thing that pushes us over. But theory is not keeping up with that bandwagon. We lack a coherent theoretical understanding of even the implications of the use of devices one-to-one within schools. There's lots of studies, lots of anecdotes, lots of bandwagon stories about schools taking something forward. Where's the theory that supports that? And another thing, something that's massive on the continent and is increasingly of interest here, is the teaching of curriculum subjects in languages other than the home language, in this case, in English. And it's burgeoned. And lots of schools around Europe are using IGCSE as a standard way of examining their students' knowledge of biology, skills of biology, in maths and history, using English language IGCSE. Where's the theory that's trying very desperately to keep up with that burgeoning development? And I think it's fair to say, no time to unpack it, but it's a contention that I think a lot of us would make. Much thinking about national curriculum, much thinking about A-level and GCSE reform in the future is simply not based on a coherent theoretical perspective. It's based on hunches, it's based on what might be seen as political goodwill, it's based on what's possible, it's not based on theory. But that second contention of David Hargreaves, the contention that educational theory simply lacks a practical element, I think we could question now. Or maybe it's changed over 10 years, and things have changed. I don't think we lack advice as teachers on what works. Someone did a study, just one journal, there were more than 361 actually good ideas over 10 years in just one academic journal published 3 or 4 times a year. You multiply the number of journals, multiply the number of blogs, multiply the number of people that you can follow that will give you loads of good advice on what works. We don't lack advice on interventions. If you go to the lobby in the main building that we were in, loads of books on things that are scarily titled like teacher-proof education. We don't lack advice on what works. And certainly, what works kind of research has been incredibly useful in supporting initiatives, in giving us the grounds for doing things in particular ways. One example is the Sutton Trust Toolkit. It might have produced things that are uncomfortable, like the argument that reduced class size is actually high cost and low impact compared with some of the other things that are much more effective and much cheaper. You might disagree with the way they've produced that result. You know, apparently, in a study in the States, it's found that reduced class size had a huge effect in Tennessee. It didn't work in California. So I suppose you put them all together, you'll get a kind of zero sum. But it is thought-provoking. And research on that kind of scale is thought-provoking, is helpful, and has taken us forward. John Hattie's work, now a major industry. This massive compilation of meta-analyses, a huge synthesis. We've got another book coming out in a couple of months, I think. It's incredibly interesting. You could argue with loads of the detail. You could argue with the fact that this aggregation does a lot of violence to the evidence, but nevertheless it raises really interesting questions, like the cluster of interventions that actually that cast teachers in the role of activators, being seen in his studies to be significantly much more effective than a cluster of effects which should be seen as teachers as facilitators. That sort of thing inevitably arouses the ire of sort of constructivists, but it's evidence-based, it's worth a discussion. These things have really taken us forward, I think, in terms of practical application of research. And of course, it's been really helpful to have the evidence that actually across the system, intra-school, within-school variation, in anything you want to measure, is often more important than inter-school, between schools. And that's something which is too often forgotten in league tables, but it's incredibly helpful to have the evidence base to make those sorts of assertions. It has an effect on policy. And again, on the level of individual pupil data, it's been incredibly helpful that assessment theory, research around the validity of assessments of various kinds has helped us to establish a pattern where schools routinely, teachers routinely, using things like Raise Online and all the other alternatives, routinely use data which is based on research and based on assessment theory to identify realistic targets of people, to design interventions that are personalised for individuals, that enable us to monitor the progress that we're making and to evaluate the interventions that have been made. These are all incredibly helpful devices. So there's no sense in which I think we're criticising research and data. But what I want to really focus on are the problems that we need to identify and overcome as teachers in schools. My assertion, I suppose, is that when you've got what works research on the kind of scale that we've got, almost threatens to drown us, we've got to identify a number of really important problems. One is that the interpretation of any data isn't obvious. Another is that a lot of the data that we have, a lot of the research programs that we have in this country are policy-driven. And the big incentive, the imperative of policy-driven research is you need to make a big difference and you need to make it quickly. And that has huge implications on what we choose to study and what constitutes education, what's seen as important. And I think there's a danger that evidence gets reduced to a very narrow range of things that can be easily measured. And that, by a process of elision, becomes what we mean by good teaching. It completely ignores the complexity of teaching, is the danger. What it does, and I want to try and unpack this for a couple of minutes, is create a very narrow view of what education stands for, a very narrow view of what we're talking about when we're talking about education. And perhaps even more importantly, it creates a diminished vision of what teachers are there for. I think we need to be, in trying to overcome the problems of research, because we need research and we need data, we need to identify how we can bring teachers into, to empower them rather than overpowering them and disenfranchising them with this kind of stick that we use data to do them sometimes. There is a problematic relationship between teachers and research that policy-driven initiatives tends to make worse in the way that they use research. First thing, I suppose, just need to unpack, and I'm making very, very sort of generalised points here, but I will leave time for discussion, and hopefully you agree with most of them, at this stage at least. First thing is that